Hi everyone, I'm here with Adi Hazan, who's the owner of Analycat Limited, and you're in the sort of the decisioning space and the data kind of space. So Adi, thanks very much for joining me.
Great pleasure.
So we originally met talking about one of your products as a bot named Sue, and we're talking about decisioning methodologies. And we had quite an interesting conversation looking at how you almost have this decisioning space. I visioned it as almost like a surface. We have a decisioning surface where you have different services, different minimums and maximums in terms of what a decision might be. What have you seen in terms of evolution of like decision logic or the complexities of decision logic within the industry? And is it evolved, or do you think there's a big opportunity there?
Look, we obviously thought there was an opportunity, otherwise we wouldn't have built it. That space that you're talking about is actually a cluster of neurons in your head.
Mm,
So the goal of our product is literally to copy the way a human being takes the decision.
mm,
We're not as data centric as our colleagues. Unfortunately, although everybody feels their data is more valuable than oil, your data always comes from the past and your business has to move into the future. It's normally a human brain that extrapolates.
mm,
And what happens with experts if I had to start to say, let's do a podcast on this, we'll link it to that, you would almost see it in your head. You use your spatial neurons.
mm.
And what Sue does is sample your spatial neurons and try and set up a little set of neurons, 20 or 30 of them, to think like you. Whereas most of the current methodologies look at big data from the past, hundreds of thousands normally, for a start, and try and model what was done. So I think I think decisioning and using AI to take decisions is happening already all the time
Mm,
to varying levels of success.
mm.
Everybody who's used a computerized chatbot when they've tried to connect to their insurance company or phone can attest to some of the levels of success being a little bit lower than they should be.
Mm. And we're in this role of like massive amounts of data, and it's almost like the data just keeps on increasing. Do you think that's causing problems in almost like getting lost in the noise? Because you need the data to be able to come up with all of the statistical decisioning versus, I suppose, almost one step removed as humans. I suppose we do that filtering first. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. Most of your data is repetitive. If I look at, let's say, IoT data,
Mm,
things work 99.9% of the time, meaning that 99% of your data could be replaced with one sample.
mm,
Unfortunately, with most learning algorithms, you never know which one that is. And the more rare an event, probably the more important it is.
mm,
Going back to IoT, where, for example, if your device is on fire, it does not send any data.
mm,
But that's probably your most important event.
mm,
So the absence of data is probably your rarest and most meaningful event and is probably never handled.
mm,
So I think the proliferation of data, people are looking for more and more rare events. And the more rare, it's much like words. If you use a rare word, it's normally because you're trying to convey a very specific meaning.
mm,
Same thing with data. But flooding yourself with a million books doesn't give you that specific piece of information.
mm,
And the cost of this data is just flying through the roof. The data centers in the world are now using more power than the UK.
mm,
It's a big expense. It's a big environmental expense. It's a big managerial expense. It's requiring more and more expertise to handle these volumes. Finding a needle in a haystack is a skilled job.
mm.
If I have a million data points and one of them is causing a problem, then I need some really specialized people to find it.
I suppose there's a bit of a balance there between almost like using human evolution to know where to look for the needles in the haystack. I suppose that's part of it, what we do with expert systems, versus finding new needles that we'd never discovered before in the massive data, which is the big data approach to a certain extent. And I suppose how do we think about the blend of the two? Because certainly over this side, it's going to cost a lot less money. It's what we've done for millennia almost in terms of finding the data. And I suppose it's, is there an equation there around what's the cost and what's the cost benefit of finding those extra insights, because basically you have to almost retrain evolution to come up with new expert insights to a certain extent.
So, Chris, I think it's a bit of a myth that's being perpetuated that this thing can find needles you didn't know were there.
Mm,
If I had to describe AI in a nutshell, metaphorically, imagine if you were in a room and people were handing in Chinese characters and you had a list of rules to tell you which characters to hand back. There's absolutely no space for innovation and creativity. If I design an AI that will look at a picture and tell me if I should build in brick, glass, or concrete, it's absolutely impossible for that AI to say, hang on, what about a combination of brick and concrete here?
Mm,
Unless I've told it that's one of its options,
mm,
there's no framework, even theoretical, even quantum at the moment, that will give you what we call in the industry a counterfactual,
mm,
that will tell you something you didn't tell it.
mm,
So there's this myth being perpetuated that we'll drop the data in and it will suddenly tell us.
mm,
Very often things that run completely counter to common sense as well.
mm, mm,
And then we run around raving for a couple of months until it all, or years, until we discover that it's just not true. I haven't seen anything that surpasses human understanding yet.
mm.
I have seen them make mistakes that a human being will never make.
One of the things that kind of concerns me, particularly with some of the recent developments, is bias, and just whether do you think that bias could potentially increase as we start, the data is almost like getting dirty because we've now got AI data going into the data. It's all like it's getting reread. So is there a danger there that we had a set of data, it worked well, but now when we're retraining it with data that might also include AI text as an example, it could almost amplify biases as well. What's the danger around that, do you think?
Life is getting constricted all the time.
Mm,
So at the moment, you have an algorithm telling you which reviews you should read online when you look at the news.
mm,
You have Netflix's algorithm telling you what it thinks you will like. Your chances of getting out of the bounds
mm,
are getting smaller and smaller. They're all working in concert in the same way.
mm,
So a nice example, I had this old list of MP3s that I downloaded 100 years ago, outtakes, rare things. And I thought, all right, I don't need to carry MP3s with me. I've got a streaming service. But 10 or 15 of those songs are not available in the streaming service
mm,
because they're rare outtakes.
mm,
So what you have is your list of options shrinking all the time. Actually, it looks like there's a zillion songs out there, and maybe there are, but any model has to simplify. And to simplify, you have to delete.
mm,
So we're definitely in a process. It's not necessarily bias so much as normalizing all of us.
mm,
Finding something rare and unusual is becoming more and more difficult.
mm,
Um, what they call the Pavarotti effect. You know, the guy that sings down the road here in Italy is probably almost as good,
mm,
but he never clicked onto the algorithm and he will never be famous.
mm,
Now, in the past, he would have been partially famous, but not anymore. Now it's all or nothing. If you click in opera, you get the five best, five most famous. You don't get diversity.
And then the reality is we're probably living in time where we've got more choice and more access to information than we've ever had, and probably in the history of humanity to a certain extent. It's the challenge seems to be how do you find it? And someone said to me the other day, it's almost like social media is almost like the filtering mechanism for you to be able to find it, except that social media mechanism to find it is driven not just by your friends, it's driven by an algorithm as well. So it's like it needs to we've got a breadth of choice, but now we've got a very sort of a narrow presentation of what's available.
And that narrow presentation is what is going to be most profitable for the presenter.
Mm,
So we're in a situation now where initially Google used to scour the net and didn't know how it was going to make money.
mm,
But now it surely does. And I mean, it can't be that if there's anybody who's going to watch this hasn't noticed how their results have become a nightmare.
mm,
There's the three advertisers because they paid for advertising. They're also on the first page, the third page, and the fifth page. And when it comes down to something that's not monetized, it now says your search is finished here.
mm, mm,
So we're being led only where it's commercially viable, social media and search and news.
mm. I started looking at social media in particular around as much as what I might be interested in and recommending what I'm interested in. It's also around what the people around me might be interested in and people who might have proximity with, people who have similar interests to me, and what does that say around like my interest, or even being a predictor around things that I should look at, or things that my friends should look at as well? It's almost like second guessing the
No,
algorithm to a certain
no,
extent.
Chris, it used to be that it was looking at your social friends and all that. Now it's looking at your social friends, seeing which of the paid advertisers are most likely.
Mm,
So that paradigm has shifted in the last 10 years. They're
mm,
all completely commercialized now.
mm, mm,
And unfortunately, their interests do not lie in giving you what you like most.
mm,
That's changed, which is very unfortunate. But what you're getting with AI is the absence of customization.
mm,
People are being normalized into silos of profitability,
mm.
and you're being led towards making more profits for them.
Yeah. And do you think that process, particularly for generative predictive tests, or GPTs, or the transformer kind of AI, has that normalization fully happened yet? Or are we still in the early stages of it, do you think? Because it feels like it's starting to get commercial, but it hasn't quite reached the levels of some of the social media companies, as an example.
Look, in a lot of places, it also hasn't risen to the level where it's actually useful.
Mm,
So, for a start, all of the words it puts out had to be put in again.
mm,
So, copyright is becoming a big issue, and there's countless lawsuits about to take place
mm,
because it can only blend, for example, with pictures. It generates a picture, but it can only blend pictures it's got.
mm,
It's a CPU, it gets numbers, it doesn't see the outside world like we do.
mm, mm,
So, we have this perception of something new, but and listen, it's happening in music a lot as well. Have you noticed how much of music is mashups from the 80s?
mm,
There was a real burst of creativity in the 80s and 90s.
mm,
And most of what you hear nowadays will have remixes of that
mm,
filtered in.
mm,
So it's happening in the whole of society and the whole of culture.
mm.
And we don't have a product that stops that, by the way. It's just the way things are at the moment.
What I thought was interesting around our conversation, really, we're talking about almost like this idea of almost like local minimums, and it's almost like this. If you look at this large data sets, it's almost like everyone falls down. I'm thinking almost like a gravity well falls down to basically the minimum, which at least is the lowest common denominator. I saw our conversation as almost like being peaks and troughs with other local minimums or other peaks that were happening, almost like on this sheet of elastic. And it's also, but the expert system allows you to find those other peaks because you're mapping the landscape rather than just rolling people down the hill to a certain extent.
So one of the problems that we have solved is that we don't just absorb data, we ask questions.
Mm,
And what we're able to do is analyze all the possibilities and say, but hang on, I know nothing about this. Now, what happens? I'll take an insurance company for an example. The guy in charge of accepting policies, the underwriter, each insurer has a flavor of risk that they like.
mm,
Some specialize in power stations. They know what they look for in a power station that
mm,
has made them profitable in the past and likely to be in the future.
mm,
That guy is not there by mistake. And all the data in that insurer doesn't include the people that were excluded.
mm,
So if you're going to model human decisions, which is what we do, but we do it on a small scale, you need to know also what is not there. And that we have solved. We can't give you an answer that you didn't tell us about. But for the first time, we can at least ask you for a data point that you haven't given us,
mm,
which is really a bit of a breakthrough. We can
mm.
say, okay, but what happens when there's no data? Oh my God, call the fire engine.
And I suppose in this sort of big data world, the one thing we didn't talk about was cost of running things as well. So I know we were talking about expert systems needing sort of light on data, and there's also light on resource as well, but also decisioning resource as well, because you're using the human-based sort of filtered decisions to make decisions quickly. I think you were using an example, I think of
Yeah.
the supermarket, wasn't it, around being able to look at SKUs and run it very fast. But there's a cost, isn't there, to using lots of data? And I think that's coming up just in terms of environmental cost. There's been quite a lot of discussion around that, I think, recently.
So costs are enormous at the moment.
Mm,
And we play and we load up an image generating program. I won't name one. And you write mutant salad, banana fish, and up it
mm,
comes
yeah.
this but they take thousands of cores,
Mm,
and those cores use tons of electricity. The data centers in the world are now burning more electricity than the whole of the UK.
mm, mm,
And a lot of companies and a lot of people are becoming very cognizant of this. Ours was designed with this in mind. So we in one of the retailers we worked with, they worked out they'd need 200 servers,
mm,
and we're using one server for 2 hours a day.
mm,
Now that's a reduction in footprint, in power consumption, an increase in speed. It has a lot of benefits. And it's very difficult for the larger AI companies to attend to that.
mm,
The only one that's really doing anything, I think, in that regard is IBM. IBM have just brought out a new infrastructure which can massively shrink your footprint. We found that one of the new IBM cores is worth about 60 normal ones.
mm,
So that's an enormous saving. And what they've done, all right, let me not go into it technically, but they've done something really good. But not everyone's going to buy an IBM machine.
mm,
So I think we're going to have a couple of waves going forward. We're going to have a wave where people start to really rebel against the commercialization.
mm,
We're going to have a wave where lighter algorithms are given preference. The best thing to move sand is a backhoe loader.
mm,
But honestly, if I have this much sand, the best thing to move it with is a shovel and a bucket.
mm,
And this and the people who sell backhoe loaders will never say that to you. So if I have 100 cases that need AI, 95 of them probably don't need big data, probably don't need a data science,
mm,
certainly don't need the algorithms of generative AI. And trying to shoehorn them in is a problem. But again, even with AI, you've got very few options. There's a list of about 40 algorithms that are being used, and innovation is actually quite small. They're making bigger and bigger ones, they're making faster and faster
mm,
configurations. But if you look at the state of the art is NVIDIA's H100 machine, it's a monster,
mm,
no doubt. But it costs a lot and it's difficult to run.
mm. So you do you think it's going to proliferate almost between almost like this generalized kind of GPT type work, which is huge amounts of data, but comes out with more generalized kind of output versus a sequence of almost like more specialized, maybe lighter kind of models, all the way down to almost like expert systems, which can be very light because it's based off human intelligence, and really it's around finding what is the right model for the application.
I think diversity's got to come back at
Mm,
all the levels of this thing. So different sizes of AIs, different kinds. ChatGPT, listen, it's amazing. I take nothing away from those people,
mm,
but I've seen very little useful live use of it.
mm,
Everybody's saying, oh, it's just changed everything. Do you know of anybody who's changed something with it?
mm,
Because I've yet to see a success case. The stats in the industry is that over 90% of projects are failing at the moment.
mm,
So that can't go on forever. Everybody is very excited. There's a lot of hype. All you hear in the news is this project was launched and that project was launched. You never get that little sort of announcement. "Well, this project is finished and worked." I
mm.
haven't seen that.
And what are you finding when you're out in the market, particularly around decisioning and decisioning systems? Are people ready to adopt that? Is there stress around operating expense? What's been the driver for kind of adoption at the moment? Because it does feel like the world, at least, is going through quite a bit of time in terms of stress around cost, and people are looking at how to take cost out to a certain extent.
So there's a lot of noise. Underneath the noise, it's like this. If you have 100 organizations, 95 can't afford to get started.
Mm,
Of the five that have gotten started 2 years ago, we would have heard something to the effect of, what, you only need one server? No, we're going big.
mm,
And now what I'm getting more and more is severe disappointment. The,
mm,
the, the feeling out there is, we've spent all this money, where's the ROI?
mm,
And I have yet to meet a client. So there's disappointment and people are now open to alternatives.
mm,
And I think it's going to happen to more and more firms. Nobody's being paid to tell you, hang on, the stuff doesn't work the
mm,
way you think.
Mm.
So more and more companies, and I'm not saying it doesn't work anywhere, caveat. Obviously, it's awesome stuff, but it's very difficult to implement fully and successfully.
Mm.
You need a lot of expensive staff. It's like a battleship. The army doesn't need 300 of them.
Mm.
You need 5 or 6 if you want to dominate half the world. The rest of the time, you're going to need smaller boats, more efficient ways of behaving, etc.
Mm. Do you think
Makes
we're
sense.
losing our do you think we're losing our way in terms of this focus on complexity? Because as human beings, we like shiny things, we like complexity, we like to make things more complicated rather than simpler. And are we losing our way on that? And should we be making things simpler and really cutting stuff back to almost like the core around this is what we need to do?
It's tantalizing to to have a bigger model, a better model, your own model.
Mm.
Unfortunately, none of the models can tell the difference between truth and fiction. We
Mm.
call it hallucinating in AI. So whatever happens, you have to check it anyway. I think at the moment, everybody's finding out that you can run these things and then cross check them with a human and they're effective.
Mm.
Definitely, the one thing that's coming is that everybody's going to get off this thing of trying to replace the humans with it.
But undoubtedly, I suppose it does help with taking the load off or the cognitive load off in certain tasks, right? There's just dangers associated. There's dangers maybe associated with that or risks associated with that. And that's what technology's done throughout human history, hasn't it? So like, I mean, we're pretty general purpose machines as human beings, but I use a car because it helps me get from A to B quicker. Now there's dangers associated with that, but I have to be careful about how I use it. Are we seeing this almost like a blend between human and machine? Do you think we'll see that sort of evolving going forward? But we just got to be aware of the dangers.
Well,
Or
it's
do
definitely
you think we'll still do what we're doing now?
utility will take a little time to penetrate. Some people are more stubborn than others. But even now, when I drive my car, if I slip lanes on the highway,
Mm.
my car rattles me and tells me,
Mm.
which I think is fantastic because you do that after over long distances.
Mm.
You lose concentration. It wakes me up, and after 2 hours, it tells me stop and have a break
Mm.
and
Yep.
starts moaning at me.
Yep.
So, augmented intelligence, I'm all for it. Tell me as an attorney which cases I might have missed,
Mm.
but let me take the decision and check it.
Mm.
Tell me if I'm a doctor about a couple of rare diseases. So, computers don't forget,
Mm.
humans do.
Mm.
Computers don't understand, and humans do. So, there are pluses and minuses for both entities. Only one of them is conscious. One is
Mm.
thinking, one is processing.
It
And the
strikes me that
combination is killer if you use it with human intelligence. It runs like a dream.
mm, it strikes me that one of the real dangers is outside of we talked about the data and whether it's just generating bias, but the other danger is almost like the human's belief that the computer's always right. So we've almost grown up in the last sort of I don't know, 30 odd years that whatever comes out of the computer, because we've almost seen them as almost like engineering machines, right? So they're like a machine where the computer's always right because they're doing very sort of basic tasks, although they're very complicated, and they're giving out almost like engineering type answers. But when we get into these statistical processes, we get into much more of a human type discussion around, well, it's probably right, or it might not be right, or it might not be right, which is actually a human kind of characteristic around if you tell me something, you might question whether I'm telling, if I have all the facts or not, right? It's actually a human type thing. So do we need to relate to computers differently?
So there's a couple of things. First of all, interestingly, that has a downside for computers as well. If the computer makes a single mistake and you can't fix it and it keeps repeating the mistake, human beings won't accept the device or the
Mm.
program.
Mm.
So if it keeps doing the wrong thing, it elicits a very bad reaction from us.
Mm. Mm.
And then I think we're being brainwashed very systematically. Nobody is being paid to give us the whole story. I was sitting with an attorney. She specializes in GDPR and in privacy. And she says, yeah, but did you see that some kid was sick and there was an article and had a very rare tropical disease and they typed it all into Google and Google gave them the right diagnosis and none of the doctors did.
Mm.
Now, we call that neglect of probability. We marvel at coincidences instead of looking at the stats. Nobody writes an article of the 4,000 times that a doctor gets told, but maybe I've got this, and the doctor says, yes, I know you did 30 seconds on Google, but
Mm.
I've been studying this for 30 years and actually not.
Mm.
So nobody advertises the outtakes, if that makes any sense.
Mm.
And the outtakes are many. They advertise the one success because they have budgets, excuse me, and nobody's going to benefit commercially from telling you all the times it goes wrong.
I think the other thing there is the media, as an example, also like talking about the outliers. So we like talking about the outliers. We like talking about the exception that kind of proves the rule. Either end. So we talk about the extremes, but actually, in medicine, then you have to deal with the mean, don't you? Dealing with the mass in the middle around making sure that's statistically right. But actually, the conversation happens around the mean. Now, and this is happening in politics as well. So the conversations around that, and it gets the airtime versus the center, which is really the vast majority, but it's like the
Yeah,
extremes are influencing the center to a certain extent.
it's and it's only interesting and newsworthy if it's an outlier.
Mm.
But nobody is being paid to give you the whole story.
Mm.
The best example. How many years of your life, Chris, have you watched the news and this person comes on to predict tomorrow's weather?
Mm.
Now they're using the most sophisticated computer in the world.
Mm.
How often are they right more than a day ahead? Very rare. Yet they come back with ice cold blood, impervious to embarrassment.
Yeah.
And we've reached a point where we react to it as if it's true.
Mm.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's going to be a great day tomorrow. Let's go. We're going to barbecue. We go, we buy steaks. Meanwhile, it rains.
Yeah.
The next night, they say it's going to be bad weather. We say, oh, you better wear your Macintosh.
Yeah.
And their attachment to the future is very small,
Yeah.
I'm
Maybe,
afraid.
maybe we need an alternative weather channel where they say, look, we run these 12 different simulations with different starting points, and the probability of this particular scenario happening is X, and this one here is X2, X3, X4, and just talk about the complexity. It might take an hour and a half,
This
but
is it. That they do a good job. I just wish that they would present it. And now they do try and say there's a 30% chance of
yeah.
rain. But you understand, if I tell you there's a 30% chance I'm going to go and have lunch now, it means I actually have no idea what I'm about to do.
Mm. Mm.
And we need to start to take all of it with a pinch of salt. Elon Musk's job is to tell you that full self-driving is a year away.
Mm.
They're there to sell these cars.
Mm.
It is right, and that's what they do.
Mm.
So we need to start to buy with a skeptical eye and test things thoroughly and not accept scope shift. Oh, yeah, it was going to answer all your clients' questions. Now it will only answer clients' questions if they have these 7 words in them.
Mm. So,
It's
and
difficult.
what's the antidote for that for us as consumers? Because it's becoming more complex. It's layered, isn't it? And I think this is another layer that's being added where we're further away from almost like the detail. Um, what's the antidote to it? Because I mean, there's a competitive advantage around being able to take quick decisions or having this extra information or be able to look at legal cases. There's definitely a competitive advantage, but as you say, there's dangers with that.
So, I mean, what's the biggest pressure? Your board calling you in and saying, everybody that we drink with has spent 4 million on AI and we've spent nothing.
Mm.
Now, what do you say to your board? And they're all getting great benefits because none of them will tell you the truth.
Mm.
So I think it's just a painful learning process we're all going to go through. The stuff I'm saying is starting to become more and more widespread,
Mm.
especially in high-end organizations. Mathematical modeling has been around for a long time. It's extremely effective. But that's all it is.
Mm.
There's no intelligence there. These are mathematical models.
Mm.
And they are advancing, but they're nowhere near where they should be.
Mm.
And I think there's just going to be a process of pain. There are a lot of people now making a lot of money off proofs of concepts that
Mm.
would never have flown.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're dishonest. I think they believe that they're on their way to something. I think that Tesla is trying to get somewhere and working really hard to bring it forward. But unfortunately, it's not as easy as they had hoped.
Mm.
And the human being, I think one of the things we are going to realize is that we actually are quite special.
Mm.
This is War of the Worlds The problem is, of course, the humans, but they're actually not the problem. They're wonderful.
Do you think like the hype often outruns the reality by about like 10 years? It feels. I think maybe that it's shortening a little bit. So, for example, the hype around the internet, as an example, in the turn of the century, outrun the reality of what we see today by about like 10 years or so. And it just feels like we get a lot of noise around things, but it's actually a little bit more difficult than people think.
Look,
And then
I
it
no
takes a while for it to
longer
come through.
rent DVDs or VHSs, and I no longer get a lot of physical post.
Mm,
And I have access to a lot more media. How much else has the internet changed for you?
mm,
Has life as you know it transformed? No, we're doing our shopping. Our kids, God bless them,
mm,
leading us dry and making us work. Life carries on.
yeah.
And I was sitting with a regulator in one of the countries and they said, need to put you in touch with our innovation hub. I said, as long as they don't, their job is to disrupt. And I said, oh no,
Mm.
I don't, there's certain words you don't use in front of me. Disrupt is one of them. Because after all this disruption, how much has changed?
Yeah.
So we're not disrupting nearly as much as we claim.
Yeah.
Let's just focus on what we can do and all start to be more realistic. I'm not sure we're 10 years, in fact, I am sure we're not 10 years away
Mm.
from human-like intelligence. These
Yeah.
things cannot generate anything that was not put into them.
Yeah, just an Italian example. So you went round Herculaneum or Pompeii as well, and you just realize there how little life has changed, right? In many ways, so much of it is very familiar. In just you'll see today, some of the finer bits on the outside, on the higher end with the cars and those sort of things, you don't have the technology, but at the end of the day, life's kind of the same, and it's very relatable, very, very relatable. Um,
Yeah, you're going to be eating and meeting people and
yeah,
doing your life.
yeah, yeah.
And it's a bit of a question how much weather forecasting has changed life for us.
Mm, mm,
Most of us would look outside, oh, better take something today. Most of us still get caught out once in a while. It's just life.
yeah.
Now, climate change, on the other hand, is definitely changing patterns and things for us.
Mm, mm,
And interconnectivity, things like COVID, I would say that's pretty novel.
mm,
But we need to start making adjustments for those things. We need to start looking for technologies that are doing less environmental damage.
mm,
We need to start thinking more carefully how we respond to certain kinds of threats. I'm in
mm,
full agreement.
mm.
But the disruptor, I'm not looking outside and seeing driverless cars while I sip the martini that my robot made for me. I don't know if you are.
No, I'm not. Yeah,
No, no
I don't
one
have
is.
I
but
don't
they
have the
keep telling
martini
us
robot either.
it's here, it's a year away. It's been a year away for long enough for us to now settle down and say, right, does this work now? Can I get a return on this investment? Is it worth doing for me?
Mm. So, Addy, thanks very much for making the time. And my kind of takeaway from the discussion is almost like we need to go back to thinking through processes uh, carefully and probably also simplifying them and then making really strategic investments and making it easier rather than just adding on more complexity, I think, to a certain extent. And that seems to be your coaching from that. Undoubtedly, there's new maths you can use to look at decisions, but it's right. Let's just make sure there's almost like that value really in all of our processes rather than getting too excited by it.
Yeah, it's too much hype, too little delivery.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Addy.
All right. Thanks for the time, Chris.
Thanks.